recording on this computer, okay? And then secondly, let's see. So Donna, I will, can I email you, Donna, on my phone while Sam's talking, and then we can have Jerry join us? So I can send you the link on the email.
Yeah, just a regular Zoom invite?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Send that to me and I'll silence my thing and close out.
Don't bother, I got it.
Oh, Jerry,
good.
Okay.
Right.
I got it, I figured it out. Sorry to be so stupid. Sorry to be so stupid.
All right.
No, you're not.
Okay,
I'm
thanks.
used to yours, Donna.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. All right, now we're up to
right.
9 folks. Thanks, everybody. Okay, let's everybody else mute your microphones, and let's turn the floor over to Sam. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Patty. I'm glad everybody could make it. This talk is going to be about how Moore's law, which is this microscopic principle, drives system-level design for virtual reality. First, I'm going to explain what Moore's law is, why we need to think about it right now, why it's changing, and why that matters for AR and VR, which is augmented reality and virtual reality. Moore's law, simply put, states that on a new microprocessor, or on a new processor, the number of transistors per unit area doubles every 2 years, because we get better at printing transistors onto a chip, and we can make them smaller, cram more transistors in the same area. Transistor is like a basic building block of a computer, and this is what's been behind this kind of 5-decade-long boom in computing. I mean, this is what's responsible for the miniaturization of computers, for example. Computers used to fill rooms, and now they fill your pocket. It's also responsible for the performance improvement. Your iPhone has more performance than the supercomputer that took us to the moon, for example. Because as transistors get smaller, we can also flip them faster. That's kind of an implicit effect of Moore's law. And since we can switch them faster, we can just make computers faster just by the physical hardware becoming faster without having to change very much about the code. So this is behind this huge growth. And I think I can safely say this is the most important trend in computing is this is what's been able to deliver year after year growth, illustrated by this chart. Yellow, we see the number of transistors per processor. The processor is just the heart of a computer. And blue, we see the performance. So transistors, keep getting, and this is a log scale, so exponentially more transistors in each chip, and they get exponentially faster until, and this is where things get interesting, in about 2004, when we have more transistors, but the performance is kind of leveled off. There are a couple of reasons for this, but they kind of boil down to diminishing returns and the fact that it's just, we've already taken a lot of the low-hanging fruit and shortcuts to get more performance, such that newer transistors, they're made with a different process. So even though they're smaller, it's actually harder to switch them faster. That kind of scaling has broke. The performance scaling due to Moore's law has started to level off. And that is really important, because how are we going to deliver, increasing performance if we can't just get this, we have to find a new way to deliver increasing performance rather than just relying on transistor scaling. Does anybody think their computer is already fast enough and they're okay with it? It doesn't need to be any fast, doesn't need to be improved in any way? I didn't think so. There are still plenty of problems that are outside the reach of even modern day computers. And so in order to support those novel applications, we need to find some more performance, and it can't just come from transistor scaling. And virtual reality is going to be a really good example of something that we can kind of do partially with modern day computers, but we need new innovations to really successfully exploit applications in virtual reality in the future. So what comes next? There are a couple of tricks we can do to eke out some more performance. The first one is parallelism. So parallelism is when you can't necessarily do one task faster, but if you can split it into chunks and have multiple actors work on each chunk, then you can complete the bigger task faster than any single one of those actors could have completed that task. So I'm going to give an example of looking, let's say you have a phone number and you don't know who it belongs to. So you're going to look through the phone book, find this phone number, and find the name of who it belongs to. This is analogous to a computer looking through a database for an entry. But I think it's easier to understand with phone books. So you could take all of the pages of the phone book, and let's say this phone book has 4 pages, and look through them all yourself. That would take a very long time. What if you could somehow divide this phone book divide the workload into pieces, like maybe give each page to one of your friends, and you get 3 friends and yourself, and each of you just have to look through 1 page. You can actually finish that task in 1/4 the amount of time, even though none of you are individually faster than the previous case. So if we can't have faster transistors, maybe we can just have more transistors. We can take advantage of the fact that we can still have exponentially more transistors, even though they're not faster. We can split up the workload, parallelize the workload, and compute tasks more quickly.
Good question, Sam. So doesn't parallelism depend on the idea that the tasks are sort of independent? And so if you have dependencies between them, then you may not be able to fully parallelize it.
That's exactly correct. And so not all problems are so easy to parallelize. A lot of them actually have to be reprogrammed in order to take advantage of parallelism. And parallelism is not a silver bullet because of this reason. There are even some problems that even if you reprogram them are still not going to be very much more efficient on a parallel system. So this is not the silver bullet. That's why we've got a second strategy, which is specialization. The CPU is CPU is the heart of a modern day computer, and it's a general purpose processing unit. It's not optimized for a specific task. But that means that for some tasks, it actually does redundant work because it's optimized for the general case, not a specific task. If you look at the chip inside of an Apple iPhone 11, for example, this is that chip that powers the iPhone. They do have a CPU, but they also have specialized processors like this NPU, specialized for neural networks, GPU, specialized for graphics, and a CPU specialized for very small, low latency tasks. So the point is that if we can't have faster transistors, but we can have more transistors, then we can have a lot of specialized circuits and have them just select the one specialized circuit that is optimized for like this individual task, like if it's graphics or if it's a neural network or something else. So, and you're kind of right to point out that it's actually still not very easy to get performance. I mean, in the Moore's law, in the days of Moore's law, kind of performance would come from free just from the underlying compute substrate getting faster. And both of these involve software changes. It kind of are a lot of effort. But because Moore's law has started to slow down, we actually care a lot about these things today. And the challenges behind these things are actually what my research is on. So specialization and parallelism are both easier said than done. So the first kind of challenge when working with one of like a post-Moore's law system is data movement. So you have this GPU, highly specialized. It can, do process on gigabytes per second. But the only problem is main memory. The connection between the GPU and main memory might not be able to supply this GPU with gigabytes per second because it has to go through this narrow connection. So kind of getting the data into the processors, keeping them fed with data, so to speak, actually becomes a challenge where it wasn't previously. It was not a challenge previously because with a single processor, there's only one place for the data to go. So a second kind of challenge is that we need novel algorithms, because you have to rethink your sequential problem that might have dependencies between tasks. You have to rethink how to make that into a parallel problem and minimize those task dependencies. Oftentimes when you split up a task into 4 pieces, each piece is going to be actually a little bit bigger than 1/4 of the original task, because there's overhead. So in the phone book example, there's the overhead of cutting the phone book into 4 pages, assigning each page to your friend, assembling your friends, getting them together, assigning each page to a friend, coming back together after you've both looked through your pages to see what you found. So all of those things are overhead that are not present when you're just looking through the phone book by yourself. So it turns out that when you split the algorithm up this way, each of these small tasks might actually be a little bit bigger. And depending on the parameters, it's not necessarily more efficient to parallelize. So you kind of have to really rethink the algorithm to minimize, to make it run efficiently on this new compute substrate. The next thing is we need new programming languages, because a lot of the existing programming languages were designed from the single processor days, and they just treat multiple processors as multiple copies of a single processor. This is really bad for 2 reasons. One is that it's really hard for humans to reason about concurrent actors in a system. And oftentimes code written for multi-core systems is much buggier than code written for a single processor system. The second reason is that these processors are actually individually specialized for different tasks. So the same programming language might not make sense for every processor. Because the programming language provides the instructions for the processor, but there are some processors where they're so specialized that their instruction set is so different that actually a different programming language might make more sense. So we need to figure out a way to combine these new and different programming languages into one program. And another challenge is system integration. So let's say we have our good old CPU like before, but we also have 2 specialized processors, a digital signal processor and a graphics processing unit, which are specialized for individual tasks. Notice how they're all 3 talking to the main memory. So memory could become a bottleneck, which exacerbates the data movement problem. They also all 3 talk to the CPU. They take instructions from the CPU, because the CPU is general purpose and runs the operating system. So the CPU could also become a bottleneck. So these are all problems kind of in all computing domains. We have these problems with power, performance, and area constraints. Power being like how much power the circuit utilizes and how well it can dissipate heat. Performance being the speed that we were talking about before, and area being like the physical size of the chip. But these 3 constraints are especially stringent in augmented reality and virtual reality. In mobile computing, for example, like on your iPhone, you can kind of skimp out on performance because you can offload so much to the cloud. In supercomputing, you can skimp out on area because if you're already occupying a whole building, it's not that expensive to make if each chip takes up more space. But trying to have a chip that you can fit in someone's glasses or on someone's headset requires performance, requires a very small area. The performance has to be good enough to fool the human into thinking that they're in an immersed in a virtual reality, and the power has to be such that it can be untethered, run on batteries, and not heat up too much that it won't burn your face. There are a lot of the other thing about this domain, besides the fact that it has the most stringent requirements in these 3 areas. It's also like very well funded because there are so many novel applications. Like this is a virtual reality application where this student is understanding how some machine works by being immersed in a virtual reality. And this is augmented reality, where it's like Google Maps, but the arrows kind of show up overlaid in real life. So you can see exactly where to go without having to look down at your phone. I should clarify, virtual reality is when the user is completely immersed in some in a virtual space, whereas augmented reality mixes elements from the reality that the user sees and overlays graphics like these arrows on top of that. So there are commercially available virtual reality systems, but they have kind of constraints that make them not as useful as we'd like. For one, a lot of them have to be tethered to a power source and to a computer, and they're not powerful enough to use in the applications that we'd like. So this is an example, a Microsoft HoloLens that you can buy today. It consumes 10 watts of power, has 4.4 resolution of the screen, and it has the area is 79 cubic or square millimeters. But in an ideal system, according to perception science experts, we would want the power to be 1/100th of what it is now, but the resolution to be 50 times what it is now, and the area to be almost 1/10 of what it is now. One of the reasons that this is so stringent is because it has to fool the part of the brain that's evolved to interpret signals from the inner ear and tell you what you expect to be looking at when you move your head. This system has to be so fast that when you move your head, it produces a new image that is consistent with what your brain expects. And that kind of system has been, between the inner ear and the vestigial system, has been refined over billions of years of evolution to be extremely fast. And if we're slow by even more than 10 milliseconds on producing a new image after you turn your head, it causes motion sickness, and that causes uneasy feeling. People need to take off the headset. It's a very unpleasant experience.
That reminds me of my old psychology studies of virtual reality where, the dependent variable was how many times somebody throws up trying to use this system. So yeah, exactly right. That if you don't have like the same kind of experience you have in the real world, then the virtual world can be very discombobulated.
Exactly. So my research has been in building a system for virtual reality where I can test solutions to all of these problems I mentioned earlier, like in data movement algorithms, programming languages, and system integration. So we're hoping to generalize these solutions outside of the domain of virtual reality as well, once we prove them out. The first solution is for data movement. So remember this diagram where all three of these processors have to talk to the main memory to get stuff done, to get data loaded? What if we put a tiny memory chip in front of each processor, such that if they can take the most commonly used data items and store them locally, so they don't have to go all the way back to main memory the next time they need that one data item if they think they might reuse it. This is not entirely new. It's called caching. And the idea of trying to keep these two caches synchronized is called cache coherence. But the novel thing that I'm trying is that it's called Spandex cache coherence, which is called as such because it's very flexible. It can fit all of these different accelerators, and it permits these peer-to-peer cache transactions that don't have to go through the main memory first. So one processor's cache can directly update another processor's cache, and they can collaborate on data that way much faster. And this helps solve the data movement problem. The next solution that I'm testing out is this programming language infrastructure called HPVM, which takes in some high-level language and compiles it and emits code for all the different specialized processing units. This is already difficult because this compiler basically has to speak 3 different languages and whatever other specialized processors you have. But so it's already a challenge there. But what's even more interesting is that since the compiler sees the whole high-level language, the whole high-level program, it can actually insert in communication points between the CPU and GPU kind of between specialized processors. These communication between specialized processors can utilize these peer-to-peer Spandex cache coherence messages, so it can compile code to take advantage of this special feature of our system. And then there's the problem of scheduling tasks. In virtual reality, there are so many different tasks that all affect the user in different ways. For example, eye tracking and seeing and figuring out where the user is, which is what SLAM does. There's so many different tasks. They all have different deadlines. They all have different frequency requirements. Eye tracking needs to be run at a very high frequency because your eyes move much faster than your head. However, they affect the user in different ways. It's unclear the difference. What if eye tracking is 1 millisecond late versus what if some other component of the system is 1 millisecond late? So the job of scheduling is to take all of these things, which also may require some combination of compute resources. See, because when all of the processors are the same, and they're all CPUs and none of them are specialized, it's much easier than when some tasks require a specific set of these specialized processors to do their job that might conflict with some other tasks specific set of processors. So the job of scheduling is to arbitrate between all of these tasks which need to be done, figure out which should run when and on what processors. In order to do that, it needs to know how it's actually going to affect the end user. And then for algorithms, this is what I'm doing, going to be doing the more work on in the future. But the idea right now is to use approximate computing. So there are some specialized processors that can do floating point operations with less precision, but much faster and much more power efficient. And if you're only trying to fool a human, it turns out that the latency, like how quickly it takes for you to do the computation, is much more important than how accurate it is. So you can actually sacrifice some precision to take advantage of specialized computing, specifically in the form of approximations. So in order to test out all 4 of these ideas as kind of solutions, I actually built, with my research group, we built out an extended reality testbed, which simulates a virtual reality experience, and we can tweak one of the parts of the system, like maybe tweak one of our solutions and see how it's going to affect the end user. So I'm going to give a quick demo. If this works, we shall hope. Yes. So this is what a user would see on their headset. There are 2 eyes because the headset is split up into 2 screens, one for the left and one for the right eye. And they're just kind of seeing this virtual world with island with trees and rocks. And we can change something about how the system works, run this program, and see how it affects what the user would actually see, what impact on performance it has. We've designed this to be easy to use so that other research groups can actually go in and test their innovations as well. It's for that reason, we've made it completely modular so you can insert your own components at will. And our website is here. So the thing I want you to take away is how important Moore's Law is, but how it's starting to die, or at least take a different form today because of this performance scaling that was once very good and is now starting to level off. That insight fundamentally changes how we build systems. We now care a lot more about specialization and parallelization than we did before. And these 2 techniques are especially applicable to the AR/VR space, for which I've, with my research group, built out this test bench so that we can test out solutions to those 2 problems and hopefully generalize them beyond AR/VR. That's the end of my talk. All
right, applause, applause. Thank you very much, Sam. One question I had for you was, have you heard of the Spatial Standard Observer? The Spatial Standard Observer is a computational model of human vision put forth by Andrew Watson some years ago. And it's a nice algorithm for looking, and it sort of works on static images, but it's kind of the same idea that you were mentioning about having a computational model that can sacrifice some precision to approximate like a pretty good algorithm. So it again is sort of focused on replicating the experience of a human visual observer, not a computer. But this is kind of where you get into things like, you know, how good does my image processing have to be to put out a result that a person, so if a person cannot tell the difference between these two images, then you can actually empirically verify that with this spatial standard observer model. Anyway, so that's one thing that I thought of as you were talking about that.
We use this metric called SSIM, Structural Semantic Image, Structural Similarity Index Measure, which tries to compare two images, and it tries to be independent of things that the human won't notice. It tries to basically say how different in human perception are these two images. So we use that right now. I think, though, it would be interesting to look into the spatial observer model as well, maybe to get the perspective right.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And in fact, I'm sure that these guys know about each other, because I think that the spatial standard observer gives you the just noticeable difference metric as an output. Yeah, so in psychology, for those of you not in psychology, that's actually a thing that you do, is you give people different visual stimuli and you ask them, are these two things different or the same? And then whether it's, you know, brightness or contrast or some other feature, and then you can actually empirically derive like what things are just noticeably different or not, and that's actually a measure that people can apply in these kinds of things. Very cool.
So I have an additional question kind of relating to human perception. In robotics, there's this thing when it comes to, there's this thing called the Uncanny Valley. So someone develops a robot that looks clearly like R2-D2 or something. Humans are perfectly fine with that. And then they develop them more and more and get them to look more and more like humans. And there's this thing where humans perceive these robots at higher and higher. They like them when they look more like humans. And then suddenly, right before they look exactly like human, but you can still tell there's something like weirdly wrong, not human about them, the like human approval rating of these robots decreases drastically, and people start to get these like visceral angry reactions about these robots. So I'm wondering, sorry about that long diatribe, so I'm wondering, is there something like an uncanny valley for virtual environments, either in the AR or the VR kind of world?
Well, I am not as familiar with the development of the environments themselves, since I've been working on systems to support those environments. What I can say about the systems is there's this interesting experiment where you inject latency. So you have a system that has zero latency, and you artificially inject latency such that user turns their head and then the image updates in that order. And what those perception science people have found is that the shape of the curve is a little bit different. So instead of going like kind of a U shape like Uncanny Valley, it goes like very bad, then it starts to increase, and then after a while, after the latency is pretty small, it doesn't matter if it gets half as small. So it's a different shape of curve, but that sounds like a very similar idea. And a lot of this actually is very related to perception science as well. So I'm glad you brought that up. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that was great. Well, and I guess I haven't been paying attention to AR very much, but I do remember like when Google Glass came out, you know, a few years ago now, it did not do as well sales-wise as it was, you know, as Google, I'm sure, hoped it wanted to. And so I wondered if there was a correlation between, you know, augmented reality and things like the Uncanny Valley, that humans actually didn't really appreciate having their natural world augmented in that way.
I think one of the problems with Google Glass was perception. People kind of didn't want to be talking to somebody who might not be paying attention to them because they're looking at something totally different.
Yeah.
I'm not sure the details, and that's something that we have to like. It's something that we have to keep in mind when we're choosing applications. We want to pick like the best possible application. So there's a lot of stuff in healthcare, job training, education that are really, I think, will not have the same perception problems that people really like, because they can be democratizing. Like if there's a really good teacher, they can only be in one classroom at a time. But if you put a VR headset on all the students, they could teach, thousands of people at a time. Or for like job training or something where you can try out putting, what it would be like to repair an oil rig on the derrick itself, but in a safe environment. So I think perception by the public matters a lot, and it's something that we think about when choosing applications to consider.
So does anybody else in the audience have a question? Well, I have a short, go ahead, Donna.
I was just going to say, do you think mere mortals can ever really understand this?
What do you mean?
Actually, no, I'm just kidding. I mean, it really is. I'm not sure that I understand. If Moore's law fades away, as it sounds like it's not gone, but the trajectory that you set forth at the very beginning doesn't look very promising. Is there a downside to that, or it seems like it sounds like it's a good thing because it's enhancing performance and yada, yada, yada. But is there a downside to this, doubling every 2 years for Moore's law? And what does it do for industry? It's kind of a change.
So Moore's law was originally phrased with the count of transistors, but it turns out if you look at how much Intel spends on R&D, it also doubles every 2 years. It's something like that. It grows exponentially. So industry, Moore's law is not some law of physics. In order to keep it going, they have to put more and more effort into it because all the low-hanging fruit was already caught. So in order to keep, improving on the transistor counts, they have to spend exponentially more on research because of the law of diminishing returns. And we're brushing up against the limits of physics itself. Like Moore's law will have to be dead by no later than 2036, because just by Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, if the transistor gets so small, they're trapping electrons in a box, and then electrons will just, according to the uncertainty principle, just tunnel out of there eventually if it gets too small. So because we're brushing against these really fundamental limits, it's costing companies more and more to develop. So that is kind of one way that in semiconductor manufacturers feel the effect of Moore's law. It's maybe not necessarily a positive. I mean, it just costs more.
Is that where quantum computing then comes in?
That's a great question.
Moore's law, you go into quantum computing itself.
That's a great question. Quantum computing is really great for certain problems in certain domains. So there are kind of two limitations. So the first one is that quantum computing is so delicate that it needs to be protected from even the tremors that are going under your feet right now that you don't feel. And it needs to be colder than interstellar space. Those are only conditions you can replicate in the bottom of a data center, in the basement of a data center. So it's probably not in the near future going to become like a consumer like technology that we're going to have in virtual reality headsets. But even if we solved engineering problems like that, there's this other thing that quantum computing actually only speeds up certain programs, like certain kinds of programs. For most of them, it's actually not going to provide any benefit over classical computing, even if given like engineering, even given like a lot of engineering effort. It's because it's not fundamentally different from classical computing, except for in one way. And if you don't take advantage of that one thing, then it doesn't run it doesn't run the same programs faster. You have to take specific advantage of the quantum features of that. So quantum computing will become very important for many problems, but it'll become important for cryptography problems, especially, but I'm not aware of any problems for which there's a quantum algorithm in the virtual reality space. So it can help with certain problems, and we still need research in classical computing for all the rest.
Yeah, Patty, thank you very much for asking that quantum computing question. I was very interested as well. I've kind of heard it described. So in my pre 5 p.m. world, I'm the executive director of the Chicago Quantum Exchange. So of course we think about this all the time, and I've heard it kind of described as, of course nobody knows exactly where these technologies will be in 50 years. But it's, one of the ways I've heard it potentially described is that it may be similar to like that image that you put on with the graphics processor, where most of your computing will still be done on a classical computer. And then for optimization problems or problems that require quantum computers, essentially it'll shoot it out to that, quantum, processor, and then bring it back to the classical world. So it won't help, with all of the, every aspect of computing, but for specific aspects, it'll be very useful.
That also leads me to think about biological computing. And so like what was used to be called cybernetics, which is and you think about the cyborg and Lieutenant Data on Star Trek and other kinds of human-machine hybrid systems. I mean, there's another kind of aspect of augmented reality that might be, kind of corneal implants, and there's a lot of interesting stuff on brain implants, whether it's for recovering from traumatic brain injuries. But you could think about actually engaging the biological system and having, the definition of humanity itself changing over time as technology becomes embedded in humans. So that's a whole other kind of sci-fi thing. but there have been some specific applications for this related to injury recovery and possible other kinds of biological computing, or what might sometimes is called embodied cognition. If you think about a smart robot as one that knows it's in a world and can take advantage of that world.
There is some work on that I'm aware of that it's trying to help patients who have seizures, kind of like the same way you need a pacemaker to help your body make a beat for your heart. If you can implant a chip in, it's experimental, that they're experimenting with implanting a chip in the brain that when you're about to have a seizure, kind of shocks the neurons in just the right way to kind of like disengage. And that actually has many of the same problems. It's extremely area constrained. It needs to have very low latency because it needs to catch the seizure within like tens of milliseconds. And it's extremely power constrained because it has to be inside your brain. So it actually, like, at a conference, the paper that they presented faced many similar challenges to the AR/VR space. And that's why I think it's like, I'm really hoping that these solutions can be generalizable. So we can like find them in AR/VR, which is well funded, and then we'll be able to develop them there in that like nice nursery, and then take them out and use them for other things as well.
I mean, I've seen a lot of that same kind of philosophy in both NASA and DoD applications, where whether you're talking about technology on the battlefield or technology for astronauts, you've got to have long battery life or long power life. You got to have really low power requirements, and you have to have super lightweight, super portable, radiation hardened, and all this other stuff, so it can survive in a tough environment and actually be functional. So there's lots of challenges along those lines too.
Mm-hmm.
And to the point about quantum computing, you mentioned like kind of like a quantum coprocessor is what I would call that. That kind of thing is possibly, like, I don't know exactly what it will look like because it's so far into the future, it's hard to tell. But it might look something like the way we treat graphics coprocessors, which like they have similar problems. Like they need directions from the CPU, and they might need data from memory, and those both become bottlenecks. You know, that kind of problem of data movement might still be there, in a quantum coprocessor. So actually, yeah, that's interesting to think about what that might look like, although it's very far into the future and hard to tell.
So Sam, what are you thinking about? So you have several years to go in your PhD, and after that, what are you thinking about doing? Do you have any ideas yet?
Yeah, I'm kind of split down the middle. I could go into academia or I could go into industry. I'd want to be somewhere where I can teach people. And I think they actually both have that. Like industry has a lot of mentorship more, and then academia, obviously, like professors teaching classes more, and they both have research. And I am kind of trying to keep my doors open, not close them unless they get closed, not close them myself prematurely. So yeah, I'd definitely like to do something that involves computer science research, computer science systems research.
So can I, Sam, this is Donna again. Can I ask, if it's not too personal, what types of industries or companies would you look to that would make the best use of your, skills and knowledge?
That's a good question. I think, so there's a lot of big companies like Google and IBM that are so big that they can do research with very long time outcomes. Like Google was trying to like end aging or something, like very long. They don't have to capitalize on it immediately. They're willing, they have so much money from other things that they're willing to take more risks on long-term research. That is a great environment because that I might have some kind of freedom there. I think with a big tech company, it really depends on what team one is working on, because Google does 500 things and like 250 of them are good and 250 of them are bad or something. And it really depends on what you're working on within Google. I mean, like obviously expanding internet access is a really good thing, but then there are kind of more social problems with other aspects of Google's mission. So big tech companies, there's also an idea of working for a startup that has like a laser focus on one thing. But if you find a startup that's laser focused on one thing that's really, really good, then that could be really valuable. Like my friend is working at a startup that is trying to make the world more secure because of all the data breaches that happen. And that mission really resonated with me, even though it's a little bit outside of my field, just because I see that as like a huge problem facing computer systems in the future. So those would be the two places.
Yeah, very interesting fields ahead of you. So good luck.
Thank you.
May all your presentations be as good as they were today.
Thank you.
So Sam, I also have a kind of semi-personal question. Do you read science fiction? And if so, is there a favorite kind of VR or AR novel or story or movie that you like? Like I think of Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash as a really interesting view of the multiverse and how it impacts the economies and lives, or Ready Player One is another example of that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Not about virtual reality specifically, but Foundation by Isaac Asimov. It's really interesting because how like maybe in the future people can predict humans, even though each individual human is hard to predict, we can predict the aggregate effect of all these humans. It's the same thing as like an ideal gas. Like each atom, you can't tell what any individual atom is going to do, but you can tell this ideal gas is going to, in aggregate, expand, push on the walls of its container. That idea was really interesting to me because that's kind of like one of the last things that science has to do is understand human behavior. Completely different from my field, but I think maybe completely different from my field when you first think about it. But I think maybe there's some like deeper things that are kind of similar. Like, what if the ways that we've built systems are influenced by the ways that we operate ourselves? Like taking orders from the CPU sounds a lot like a corporation. Like those, maybe we shape the invention. Maybe the inventions we create are shaped by the concepts that we have, that we like are familiar with. I mean, if you read like people, science physicists in the Industrial Revolution era, they're talking about modeling like electric fields as strings and pulleys. I mean, I think the scientific theories are really influenced by the world in which they were brought about. So it is, makes it a prerogative to understand the world of human behavior that brings these things about. And then maybe the incentive structures as well, certainly worth looking into. And that's why foundations is interesting to me. I was kind of like a roundabout thing, but it's just because human behavior is so interesting and complex and emergent phenomena that I thought that was like pretty cool.
I think that's a great point. I mean, as you're talking about VR and AR, that's obviously a human-computer interaction kind of a framework, and then understanding what makes an environment effective, like in the novel Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson, in which you put on your suit and your goggles and you go into the multiverse and you can do a business deal in Tokyo or go have some sushi or do all these things in the virtual world. One of the things that the protagonist, his name is Hero Protagonist, the main character, he reflects on the fact that one of the programmers on his team, she was the person who really focused on the development of faces. So in the virtual world, if you're poor, you have to go to Walmart and buy a dumb avatar so you look really grainy and stupid. But if you're rich, you can get a really cool avatar, and then it has excellent facial expressions. And that's the thing that makes this world work, is being able to have that kind of human face-to-face interaction, which I guess we all might need more of right now.
Yeah.
But if you haven't, I put that in the chat. If anybody hasn't read these novels, they're really really readable and really fun to read. Snow Crash, the Foundation trilogy by Isaac Asimov, and Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. All very fun, and got a good story and stuff, but also a really interesting take on the future of technology. Are there any other questions from the audience? Or anything else, Kate? Did you want to wrap up?
I just want to say I really like Ready Player One. I think it was turned into a movie that was okay, but as usual, the book is better. Yeah, the book is much better. The movie is pretty good, but and the movie significantly deviates from some of the plot points in the book as well. Yeah. All right. Well, anyway, all right. Any other questions? I had a final word. I wanted to thank the ARCS Foundation for generously funding my fellowship. It's allowed me to do the research that I've just told you about, and hopefully much more in the future. So thank you, everybody.
Wonderful.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thanks you to Sam again for a wonderful talk. Thanks to everybody who was here. And I'll be saving this recording on my hard drive, and we'll eventually share it with members who request it from me. So thanks very much, everybody.
Thank
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Sam.
Thanks, Patty.
Thank you.